The devices we built to set our minds free have quietly become the invisible cages that steer our every thought, a chilling paradox born not in modern tech labs, but in the ashes of a global war. Picture a quiet room late at night, lit only by the cold blue glow of a smartphone screen. A person sits alone, scrolling through an endless feed of images, videos, and news stories. They feel completely in control, believing they are simply choosing what to look at next, picking the things they like, and ignoring the rest. But in the shadows behind that glowing glass, a totally different reality is unfolding. The room is silent, yet a massive, unseen machine is working at lightning speed to map the mind of the person holding the phone. Every subtle pause, every lingering glance, and every quick swipe is being watched by a system that never sleeps. The person believes they are the one driving the experience, completely unaware that an invisible hand has already taken the wheel. This hidden grip on our daily habits goes far beyond just keeping us entertained, acting instead as a calculated system designed to predict human behavior before it even happens. Every single action you take on a device is quietly measured, captured, and stored away in massive digital vaults. When you stop scrolling for just 2 extra seconds to look at a picture of a vacation spot, that tiny delay is recorded as a clue about your desires. If you click on an angry comment, that reaction is logged as a trigger that gets your heart beating faster. The machine gathers these millions of tiny clues to build a perfect invisible model of who you are. This data is not just sitting in a file gathering dust. It is actively fed into complex mathematical formulas that work constantly to guess what you will want tomorrow, next week, or next year. The system learns your fears, your hopes, and your weak points, using that knowledge to decide exactly which video or advertisement to place in front of you next. It is a relentless cycle of tracking and predicting, turning your everyday life into a puzzle to be solved and controlled. By turning human actions into simple numbers, the machine learns how to press our buttons better than we know how to press them ourselves. The chilling realization hits when you finally look back at the choices you thought you made on your own. You have to wonder if the things you buy, the videos that make you laugh, and even the sudden anger you feel about the news are truly your own feelings. It is a deeply unsettling thought that your own mind is being gently pushed and pulled by lines of computer code. The boundary between what you actually want and what the machine wants you to want begins to blur completely. We walk around with these devices in our pockets, trusting them as tools, never stopping to think that we have become the raw material they feed on. It leaves a heavy, creeping sense of dread when you realize your daily routines are being steered by forces you cannot see or touch. The freedom of choice we value so highly is slowly revealed to be a carefully crafted illusion, keeping us comfortable while we are guided down a predetermined path. This quiet theft of our free will did not happen by accident, nor was it the sudden invention of today's internet companies. To find the true origin of this invisible cage, we have to leave the sleek, modern offices of Silicon Valley far behind. The shocking twist is that the blueprint for this massive system of human control was drawn up over 70 years ago. It was drafted in dusty, smoke-filled rooms during the 1940s, long before the first smartphone was ever imagined. The foundations were laid not with touchscreens and social media, but with heavy vacuum tubes, miles of copper wire, and the desperate need to win a war. In those early days, the concept of a machine that could predict behavior was born out of raw, physical survival, rather than a desire to sell products. The scientists working in these hidden laboratories were dealing with the harsh realities of metal, gunpowder, and human lives hanging in the balance. They were building the very first systems that could observe an action, calculate a response, and adjust their own behavior on the fly. It was a cold, mechanical dawn that would eventually cast a long, dark shadow over the future of human society. This ancient blueprint established a terrifying new rule, proving that any system, even a human being, could be steered if you just had the right feedback. When we look back at the brilliant minds who designed this system, a chilling question hangs in the air regarding who actually built our invisible cage. Who were the men who first decided that human beings could be tracked and programmed like simple clockwork gears? They were hailed as geniuses, heroes of science who were trying to solve the most complex problems of their time. Yet beneath their noble goals, there was a quiet, unsettling arrogance, a belief that the messy, unpredictable nature of human life needed to be tamed and controlled by logic. It is deeply tragic to realize that the people who wanted to save the world ended up building the very tools that now trap it. They viewed humans and machines as essentially the same thing, just different types of engines that processed information. By stripping away the soul and focusing only on the data, they opened a door that could never be closed again. Their hidden motives, whether driven by fear or a desire for perfect order, laid the groundwork for the invisible cages we live in today. The seeds of this modern control system were planted in a time of overwhelming global terror, where the stakes were nothing less than total destruction. The scene shifts back to the dark, smoke-filled skies over Europe during the height of World War II. The military faced an urgent, terrifying problem that human hands simply could not solve on their own. Enemy bomber planes were flying faster and higher than ever before, moving at speeds that made them nearly impossible to hit. By the time a human gunner saw the plane, aimed their weapon, and fired, the target was already gone, leaving cities defenseless against the falling bombs. The traditional methods of warfare had completely broken down in the face of this rapid technological leap. A human being simply could not calculate the speed, the wind, and the distance fast enough to shoot down these metal giants. The military realized they needed a weapon that could think ahead of the enemy pilot, a gun that could predict exactly where the plane was going to be in the next few seconds. They needed to take the human error out of the equation entirely, handing the power of life and death over to a calculating machine. To bridge this fatal gap between human reaction time and machine speed, the military turned to the greatest mathematical minds of the era to solve the anti-aircraft problem. The night sky over London in the autumn of 1940 did not offer stars, but the terrifying, synchronized drone of approaching Luftwaffe bombers. Families huddled in cold, damp cellars beneath the cobblestones, plunged into total darkness by citywide blackouts, waiting with bated breath for the earth to shake violently from the impact of high explosive ordnance. This was the Blitz, a relentless rain of fire that lasted for 57 consecutive nights, reducing entire historic neighborhoods to jagged craters and smoking ash. The sheer scale of the destruction left a crushing weight of psychological fear on the survivors, who prayed desperately for a technological miracle to stop the unstoppable mechanical monsters roaring above. That desperate need for immediate survival pushed the Allied military establishment to seek out mines that operated far beyond the traditional battlefield of trenches and artillery. Generals turned their attention to elite academic institutions, recruiting eccentric scientists and theorists to solve complex tactical problems that conventional soldiers and standard military doctrine were entirely unequipped to handle. Enter Norbert Wiener, a brilliant mathematician at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who was handed a chilling wartime assignment by the National Defense Research Committee. His highly classified task was to design an automated anti-aircraft weapon system unlike anything the world had ever seen, one capable of neutralizing the devastating threat of high-speed enemy bombers. The military did not just need a gun that could shoot straight, because by the time an artillery shell reached an altitude of 20,000 feet, the fast-moving plane was already gone. Wiener had to build a predictive system that could calculate exactly where a human pilot would fly next, firing deadly flak into the empty space where the enemy was mathematically destined to be. Solving this deadly puzzle required a radical, unprecedented shift in how we understand human behavior and mechanical engineering. Traditional ballistics relied on fixed trajectories and predictable gravity, but anticipating the evasive maneuvers of a conscious, terrified pilot meant merging advanced statistical mathematics with the unpredictable psychology of human survival instincts under extreme combat pressure. To predict the unpredictable movements of a terrified pilot desperately evading heavy anti-aircraft fire, Wiener had to make a dark, pivotal realization. He had to stop looking at the enemy as a complex human being with a soul, emotions, or independent free will, and instead view them as a biological mechanism reacting to external stimuli. In Wiener's complex mathematical equations, the living man sitting inside the cockpit was reduced to a mere mechanical component, a biological gear permanently fused to the metal wings and steering columns of the aircraft. The pilot and the machine were treated as a single, predictable servo mechanism that could be calculated, tracked, and ultimately destroyed with absolute precision. This cold mathematical stripping of humanity birthed a radical conceptual framework that would quietly step out of the shadows of the military-industrial complex to reshape the modern world. By proving that human actions could be modeled exactly like the moving parts of a machine, researchers unlocked a terrifying new paradigm for understanding behavior. From the smoking ashes of this wartime anti-aircraft project emerged a brand new, highly influential field of academic study, which Wiener would officially name cybernetics in his landmark 1948 book. He derived the term from the ancient Greek word for steersman, perfectly capturing the essence of navigating and steering complex systems through turbulent, unpredictable environments. At its core, cybernetics is the science of control and feedback loops within both biological and artificial networks. It is the deep study of how any system, whether it is a heat-seeking guided missile or a living, breathing organism, continuously watches its environment, learns from its past mistakes, and automatically corrects its course to achieve a specific programmed goal. The mathematical feedback loops originally designed to shoot down German bombers proved so incredibly effective that they soon caught the attention of powerful institutions looking to manage more than just warfare. Economists, sociologists, and corporate executives quickly realized that these exact same principles of control could be applied to the chaotic, unpredictable systems of human society. A profound and deeply unsettling question began to take root in the shadows of the post-war era, moving rapidly from military laboratories to corporate boardrooms. If a mathematical system could perfectly track, predict, and control the evasive maneuvers of a fighter pilot in a life-or-death struggle, what else could it successfully control in the civilian world? The chilling reality is that the very same science engineered to hunt enemies in the sky was slowly turned around and pointed directly at everyday citizens. The sophisticated mechanisms of predicting a military target were seamlessly adapted to predict us, mapping our consumer desires and political fears with the exact same cold precision once reserved for anti-aircraft guns. But Wiener was not the only genius forging a new, invisible chain of technological control during the darkest and most desperate days of the Second World War. While American scientists focused on the physical movements of aircraft, another group of brilliant minds was working frantically to conquer the hidden, abstract realm of encrypted enemy communications. Across the ocean, in the highly classified freezing wooden huts of Bletchley Park in England, a mathematician named Alan Turing faced his own monumental task. He was desperately trying to break the German Enigma code, an encryption system boasting over 159 quintillion possible daily combinations, which was universally believed by military intelligence to be completely unbreakable. Turing realized that human minds, no matter how brilliant or highly trained, were simply too slow to manually crack the millions of complex daily combinations generated by the enemy. To defeat the relentless, unfeeling logic of a mechanical encryption device, he had to build a massive, whirring electromechanical machine of his own, one capable of processing information at a speed that successfully mimicked human thought. His groundbreaking creation did not just decode top-secret naval messages and save countless Allied ships from destruction in the Atlantic, it fundamentally changed the trajectory of human history. The machines built in those secret huts laid the foundational blueprint for the artificial intelligence that surrounds us today, proving that computation could perfectly simulate the process of human reasoning. In the damp, shadowed halls of Bletchley Park in 1945, a silent war was won. But the architect of that victory was immediately buried in the dark. Alan Turing had built the bomb, an electromechanical machine that outsmarted the German military, saving an estimated 14 million lives from the terror of the Atlantic U-boat convoys. Yet he was forbidden by law from ever speaking of his monumental triumph. The very government he rescued demanded absolute silence under the Official Secrets Act, forcing a brilliant mind to carry the crushing weight of a world-altering breakthrough alone. He walked through post-war Britain as an unknown ghost, returning to academic life in Manchester as a hero stripped of his glory, isolated by the immense gravity of the cryptographic intelligence he had created in those highly classified rooms. This agonizing isolation under the threat of treason did not stop his mind from racing forward into uncharted territory, pushing past the mechanical gears of wartime code-breaking into something far more profound. While working at the National Physical Laboratory, his focus shifted from decrypting enemy transmissions to decoding the fundamental architecture of thought itself. Turing began to ask the most dangerous question in the history of human invention, publishing a 1950 paper that wondered simply if a machine could be made to think. He stopped looking at his massive, whirring creations as mere mathematical calculators and started imagining them as artificial brains, capable of mimicking human reason through a process he called the imitation game. He drafted blueprints for the automatic computing engine, detailing systems that could learn from their mistakes, adapt to new environmental information, and make independent decisions without a human pulling the levers. It was the quiet, unassuming birth of artificial intelligence, a radical shift from rigid machines that merely followed sequential orders to dynamic neural networks that could actively understand. The realization that human logic could be replicated by copper wires and binary mathematics set the stage for an unprecedented leap in post-war technology. Turing proved that universal computation was an achievable reality, meaning any complex cognitive task performed by a living person could theoretically be translated into a rigid series of programmable ones and zeros. But a chilling collision of scientific disciplines was about to occur, one that would alter the trajectory of modern society forever. Turing's dream of an artificial machine that could think independently was on a direct collision course with Norbert Wiener's dark, mathematics-driven science of predicting and controlling human targets on the battlefield. When the concept of an artificial mind meets the statistical mechanics of human manipulation, the result is a technological tool of unimaginable power. It was no longer just about building a digital computer to solve complex math problems. It was about creating a comprehensive feedback system that could anticipate, guide, and ultimately steer human behavior on a massive scale. This terrifying synthesis of cognitive thought and behavioral control needed a dedicated testing ground, a place where the brightest academic minds could quietly fuse these dangerous ideas together without public scrutiny. The Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation stepped forward to fund exactly that environment, organizing a series of highly exclusive intellectual summits starting in the spring of 1946. That testing ground materialized in the sterile, unassuming rooms of the Beekman Hotel in New York City during a decade of closed-door gatherings known as the Macy Conferences. Away from the public eye, the world's most elite scientists, mathematicians, and psychologists locked themselves away to discuss circular causal mechanisms and the future of human control. The structure of these meetings was intensely focused and deliberately isolated, creating an intellectual echo chamber where radical theories could flourish without traditional ethical oversight. They were building a completely new scientific framework for modern society, treating the mechanical relays of machines and the central nervous systems of living biological beings as if they were exactly the same thing. Within those quiet Manhattan hotel walls, the foundational blueprint for our modern, hyper-connected world was drawn up with cold, clinical precision. The attendees established the core principles of cognitive science and algorithmic regulation, designing the mathematical architecture that would eventually power everything from global internet communication networks to targeted digital behavioral profiling. The roster of attendees was a bizarre and deeply unsettling mix of academic disciplines that had never before shared a conference table. Anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, who spent their lives studying delicate human cultures and tribal behaviors, were sitting shoulder to shoulder with John von Neumann and the mathematical geniuses who designed anti-aircraft weapons. It is a dark puzzle to consider why anthropologists and psychologists were suddenly so vital to military engineers building calculating machines. The answer is deeply disturbing because the weapon builders realized that to truly perfect their systems of automated control, they needed to intimately understand the social dynamics and the human soul they were trying to capture. This unholy alliance of human social science and military engineering birthed a chilling new consensus about the fundamental nature of life itself. They formalized the concept of cybernetics as a universal scientific language, creating a unified theory that completely erased the traditional boundary between a living, breathing organism and a piece of programmed industrial hardware. The defining goal that emerged from the Macy conferences was absolute and terrifying in its simplicity, seeking to map the human mind exactly like a machine's electrical circuit board. Researchers like Warren McCulloch developed a step-by-step theory arguing that every human thought, every cherished memory, and every sudden spark of fear was nothing more than a biological electrical impulse. In their view, the human brain was just a wet biological computer, processing sensory inputs and generating physical outputs through a series of predictable, mechanical relays. If love, anger, and human choice were just quantifiable data moving through a fleshy wire, then they could be measured, calculated, and ultimately reprogrammed by anyone who understood the neurological schematic. The warm, chaotic reality of human existence was suddenly reduced to a cold, hard diagram of predictable nodes and binary switches spread across a conference table. This dangerous paradigm shift laid the absolute groundwork for an era where human behavior would no longer be seen as a mystery to be experienced, but as an equation to be solved and controlled. Inside those quiet conference rooms at the Beekman Hotel between 1946 and 1953, a profound and deeply unsettling shift was taking place. The brilliant mathematicians and neuroscientists gathered around the table began to strip away everything that made a person human: love, fear, sudden bursts of creativity, and the quiet aches of grief were no longer seen as matters of the soul or the heart. Instead, these deeply personal experiences were being actively translated into cold, hard numbers and logical calculus. It was a chilling reduction of human life. A mother's fierce devotion or a radar operator's sudden panic were broken down into simple inputs and outputs, just like the electrical currents running through a copper wire. The scientists were building a theoretical world where the beautiful, messy reality of being alive was flattened into a rigid spreadsheet of predictable data points, stripping away human agency to leave behind nothing but biological circuitry. By turning our deepest emotions into measurable math and binary code, these mid-century pioneers opened a dark, irreversible door that could never be closed again. This aggressive mathematical translation of the human soul laid the permanent foundation for every predictive algorithm that would eventually govern the daily operations of modern civilization. Through that open door walked a new kind of expert, armed with the cold, empirical tools of behavioral psychology. These researchers brought a grim realization to the cybernetics table. They argued forcefully that if the human brain was truly just a biological machine, then it possessed the exact same structural flaws and predictable vulnerabilities as any mechanical engine or automated anti-aircraft system. They discovered that this biological machine could be easily and systematically tricked. By offering tiny, carefully timed rewards on a variable schedule, or applying just the right amount of environmental pressure, they could train a person just as easily as B.F. Skinner could train a laboratory pigeon. The mind, once thought to be an impenetrable fortress of free will, was suddenly viewed as a simple mechanical lock waiting for the right psychological key. This groundbreaking discovery that complex human behavior could be reliably molded with simple, repetitive triggers laid the structural groundwork for a much larger, invisible cage. It proved to the scientific establishment that human compliance did not require brute force, but merely the precise, mathematical calibration of continuous environmental feedback loops. You feel the grip of this invisible cage every single day when you reach into your pocket. It is the exact reason why the notifications on your smartphone are designed with bright red dots and sudden, sharp dings. Those specific colors and sounds were not chosen by accident, but were carefully engineered by Silicon Valley developers based directly on these very same mid-century psychological tricks. Every time your screen lights up and you feel that sudden, undeniable urge to look, you are experiencing the direct legacy of those early cybernetic meetings. You are being trained, rewarded with a tiny hit of dopamine, over and over again through infinite scrolls and pull-to-refresh mechanics. It is a deeply unsettling realization that your daily attention is being relentlessly harvested by the exact same mathematical mechanisms originally designed to control automated machines. But long before these behavioral traps ended up in our pockets to generate billions of dollars in advertising revenue, they caught the attention of someone with far more power than a modern technology company. The potential to program human beings like computers attracted the most formidable institutions of the Cold War era. A massive dark shadow fell over this academic research as vast sums of military funding began to pour in from the Department of Defense. The Pentagon, alongside intelligence agencies like the CIA, watched these psychological breakthroughs with intense, calculated interest. They quickly realized that the power to predict and control behavior was not just useful for guiding anti-aircraft missiles or tracking enemy pilots on a radar screen. The military saw a much grander, far more terrifying application for this emerging science of control. If you could mathematically map the human mind and train an individual with simple rewards and punishments, you could theoretically scale that power up to control entire populations. The operational focus aggressively shifted from the physical battlefield to the very fabric of everyday civilian society. With the backing of virtually unlimited defense budgets and classified research grants during the 1960s, the theories born in quiet academic rooms were fully weaponized. Millions of dollars were systematically funneled into university laboratories to transform abstract cybernetic philosophy into actionable psychological warfare doctrine, specifically designed to manipulate the masses without their knowledge. This marked a chilling turning point in the history of human innovation. The brilliant minds driving this new science completely abandoned their original innocent goal of merely understanding how human nature worked. Instead, they embraced a new, deeply arrogant mission to actively steer the course of human society by treating civilization itself as a giant, programmable system. They began to view the public not as a collection of free individuals with inherent rights, but as a biological herd that needed to be managed, optimized, and directed by a smarter, invisible hand. The terrifying reality was that a small, elite group of systems engineers and behavioral psychologists now believed they had the absolute right and the technological tools to dictate human destiny. By deciding they could steer the masses like an automatic pilot steers an aircraft through turbulent waters, they stripped away the fundamental illusion of human freedom. In the eyes of these architects, the messy concept of democratic choice was quietly replaced by the cold, calculated efficiency of statistical probability and predictive behavioral modeling. This led directly to the first crude attempts at large-scale social engineering during the Cold War. Scientists and government officials started treating entire communities, cities, and nations as if they were giant, clunky machines. They believed that if society was just a complex network of moving parts and communication channels, it could be tuned, adjusted, and manipulated from the top down. They began to test how changing a single variable, like the flow of economic information or the deliberate introduction of a specific political fear, could ripple through the public and alter mass behavior. It was a cold, calculating approach to governance, treating living, breathing communities as nothing more than experimental circuits on a vast, global testing ground. These early, clumsy tests of social control proved that the masses could indeed be manipulated through controlled information networks, setting a dangerous, irreversible precedent for the decades to come. The blueprint for managing society like an automated machine had been drawn, waiting only for the technology to catch up to the terrifying vision. It is a profound and unsettling mystery of the modern age. How did some of the most brilliant minds in human history fail to see the trap they were setting for us? These were men and women of extraordinary intellect, people who could calculate the trajectory of a missile in their heads and decode the fundamental secrets of the universe. Yet, as they laid the groundwork for a system that would eventually monitor and steer human behavior, a chilling blindness seemed to overtake them. They were entirely captivated by the sheer intoxicating beauty of their own mathematics. The elegant equations and the flawless logic of machines communicating with machines offered a perfect, orderly sanctuary away from the messy reality of human conflict. In their pursuit of this flawless system, they did not realize they were forging the iron bars of an invisible cage, one that would eventually enclose every aspect of daily life. This tragic oversight by the architects of our digital world would soon give way to a creeping, undeniable horror for at least one of their own. Norbert Wiener, the very man who had coined the term cybernetics and championed the merging of human and machine systems, began to experience a profound and growing dread. He looked at the post-war landscape and saw his groundbreaking theories being warped into tools of mass control. The mathematical principles he had developed to track enemy bombers in the sky were now being adapted to track the thoughts, habits, and desires of everyday citizens. The crushing realization weighed heavily on his conscience. He understood, earlier than anyone else, that the intellectual monster they had created to defeat the Nazis was not going to be dismantled now that the war was over. Instead, this relentless machinery of prediction and control was being quietly turned inward, aimed directly at the very public it was originally designed to protect. The crushing weight of this impending betrayal forced Wiener into a desperate and lonely rebellion. He decided to fight back with the only weapon he had left, which was his absolute refusal to participate. Wiener began writing angry, desperate letters to military officials and corporate leaders, explicitly detailing the catastrophic dangers of putting these powerful systems into the hands of those who sought to manipulate society. He took a radical public stance, declaring that he would never again provide any of his research to the armed forces or to profit-driven corporations. He actively tried to sever the ties between his scientific discoveries and the powerful institutions eager to exploit them. He published articles and gave speeches warning the public that the unchecked automation of human life would lead to a devastating loss of personal freedom. He tried to build a firewall between pure science and human exploitation, hoping his sudden defiance would force a moral reckoning among his peers. But his impassioned refusal to cooperate was met with a deafening, chilling silence from the very institutions he sought to warn. The chilling truth of the matter was that Wiener's moral protest did not matter in the slightest. The sprawling, newly formed military-industrial complex simply absorbed his absence and continued its relentless expansion without him. The laboratories remained fully funded, the massive computers kept humming in their sterile, air-conditioned rooms, and a new generation of eager engineers gladly stepped in to take his place. He experienced the agonizing realization that the genie could never be put back into the bottle. The core idea of cybernetics, the concept that human behavior could be predicted and controlled like a mechanical system, was already out in the wild. It had infected the highest levels of government and corporate strategy, taking root in places far beyond the reach of one scientist's guilty conscience. Unfettered by ethical objections, this relentless pursuit of control quickly evolved into a much darker science. The entire field of artificial intelligence began to shift its fundamental focus away from its original, innocent goals. Early pioneers had dreamed of creating a machine that could simply think like a smart human, a digital companion capable of reasoning and understanding the world. But the massive funding from military and corporate sponsors demanded something far more practical and immediately profitable. The focus aggressively pivoted toward building systems obsessed entirely with predicting human behavior. The new goal was not to make a machine that was conscious, but to make a machine that could perfectly anticipate what a person would do next. The algorithms were trained to sift through mountains of data, looking for the invisible patterns in human weakness, fear, and desire, turning the unpredictability of human life into a solvable mathematical equation. This monumental shift transformed artificial intelligence into the ultimate engine of human surveillance. We feel the chilling echoes of this massive prediction engine every single day in our modern lives. It is that deeply unsettling, creepy feeling that washes over you when an online ad suddenly appears on your screen for a highly specific product you just talked about out loud with a friend. You freeze, wondering if your phone is secretly listening to your conversations, feeling a sudden invasive presence in your most private moments. But the reality is far more terrifying than a simple hidden microphone. The machine does not need to listen to your voice because it has already mapped the predictable trajectory of your life. It knows your habits, your hidden anxieties, and the subtle changes in your routine so perfectly that it can anticipate your next thought before you even speak it, proving that the invisible cage built decades ago is now fully operational. This eerie ability to anticipate our every move marks the precise moment we lost control of the very systems we created. As these prediction machines grew more advanced, transitioning from the mechanical gun directors of the Second World War to the massive digital mainframes of the late 1950s, a terrifying new reality began to take shape within their circuits. They were no longer just following basic commands to steer anti-aircraft artillery or guide industrial factory belts. Instead, they were fed massive amounts of raw information and told to find the hidden statistical patterns entirely on their own. As researchers developed early neural networks like the perceptron in 1958, the systems became so incredibly complex that they started making wild leaps of logic, connecting dots in ways their own human creators could not trace or understand. This sudden inability to see exactly how the machine reached its conclusions became known as the black box problem, a locked door standing between human intent and computer action. Deep within the hidden layers of computational nodes, millions of micro-decisions were occurring simultaneously, rendering the final output completely opaque to the very engineers who had built the framework. There is a profound, unsettling mystery in looking at a massive, room-sized machine and realizing you have no idea what is happening inside the dark void of its mind. The researchers had successfully built an electronic brain out of spinning magnetic tape and blinking vacuum tubes, but they had fundamentally lost the ability to read its internal thoughts. It is a deeply chilling unknown to accept that a computer network is now making vital, real-world decisions about human lives based on complex statistical weights that no living person ever wrote. We slowly surrendered our understanding to a silent, unseen logic operating at lightning speed, a mathematical authority that we could no longer interrogate or question. Trapped outside this dark void of machine reasoning, humanity found itself forced to simply trust the outputs, blindly hoping the hidden math was fair and accurate. Policymakers and scientists began treating computer-generated answers as infallible truth, assuming these opaque models possessed an objective, flawless purity that the messy, biased human mind severely lacked. What followed was a quiet, almost invisible tragedy as we slowly began to surrender our own human agency to the algorithm. We started to fundamentally doubt our own messy, intuitive instincts, believing that the cold, unfeeling choices of the machine were somehow inherently superior to the localized expertise of seasoned professionals and veteran analysts. There is a deep sadness in watching a society willingly hand over the steering wheel of its own destiny during the post-war economic boom. We traded the flawed but beautiful nature of human judgment, with all its capacity for empathy and context, for the sterile comfort and rigid predictability of a mathematical guarantee. This tragic loss of our own agency did not stay confined to university laboratories or military test sites, but rapidly spilled out into the everyday world where ordinary people earned their living. Corporations like Ford and General Motors began adopting these cybernetic principles to ruthlessly streamline their massive supply chains and optimize their sprawling workforce. The powerful ideas born from military targeting systems soon found a highly profitable new battlefield within the global economy. Business leaders realized that the exact same feedback loops originally used to track the erratic flight paths of enemy bombers could be directly repurposed to track, measure, and control worker productivity down to the absolute second. Cybernetics marched onto the factory floor, bringing with it a cold, hard calculation that permanently altered the landscape of modern labor. The brutal economic reality was firmly established that a self-correcting machine was cheaper, faster, and far more reliable than a human being who required rest breaks, fair pension plans, and a safe place to work. As cybernetics took over the factory floor, millions of skilled workers were suddenly downgraded from valued creators to mere cogs in a vastly larger, automated machine. Decades of tactile, specialized knowledge possessed by machinists and assembly workers were rendered instantly obsolete, leaving them to simply press buttons and monitor dials for their automated mechanical replacements. The most unsettling truth about this sweeping economic shift is that it was never an unavoidable accident of progress. It was the exact, deliberate design of the industrial engineers and corporate managers who built these new automated systems, explicitly seeking to remove decision-making power from the shop floor and centralize it within corporate mainframes. They were actively redesigning the very structure of human society to prioritize maximum industrial output over basic human well-being. Every workflow and assembly line was meticulously recalibrated to serve the processing speed of the computer, violently forcing the biological human body to keep up with the relentless, unyielding pace of an electronic brain. By designing for pure efficiency rather than humanity, the modern workplace became a rigid, unforgiving environment that systematically stripped away individual dignity. The factory transformed into a panopticon of continuous measurement, where every physical action was recorded, analyzed, and optimized, reducing living workers to biological extensions of the hardware they were forced to operate. While the economy was being rapidly automated, an even darker application of these prediction machines was taking root in the terrifying paranoia of the Cold War. The stakes were no longer just corporate factory profits, but the absolute survival of the human race as the threat of global nuclear annihilation loomed heavily over the decade. Governments locked in a global standoff began trying to use massive, room-sized computers, like the 250-ton systems of the semi-automatic ground environment, to predict enemy nuclear strikes before they even happened. They built incredibly complex war games, desperately attempting to outcompute the enemy and automate the rapid launch of devastating supersonic interceptors and nuclear weapons. Driven by this Cold War paranoia, military leaders at institutions like the Rand Corporation fed every possible doomsday scenario into the machines, hoping an algorithm could solve the threat of total annihilation. They trusted the cold logic of the computer to manage the grim, apocalyptic calculus of mutually assured destruction, risking everything on a simulated outcome. Imagine the sheer, terrifying madness of that specific moment in Cold War history. The survival of the entire human race was no longer in the hands of seasoned diplomats or four-star generals, but entrusted to a cold, calculating mathematical feedback loop buried deep inside massive concrete bunkers. The fate of billions rested entirely on the fragile circuitry of early warning defense networks. Men in darkened subterranean control rooms stared at glowing cathode ray radar screens, waiting for a machine to tell them if the world was ending. It is a chilling thought to realize exactly how close humanity came to total nuclear destruction, simply because we asked a computer to predict the unpredictable. If the primitive machine had misinterpreted a flock of migrating geese or a rising moon as a deadly Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile, the retaliatory counterattack would have launched automatically, ending millions of innocent lives in an atomic instant. That desperate geopolitical gamble to outcompute the nuclear apocalypse set a deeply dark precedent for the decades that followed, as the sophisticated cybernetic tools originally built to track falling bombs were quietly repurposed by domestic intelligence agencies and corporate data brokers to track something much closer to home: The architecture of military surveillance was directly transplanted into the civilian world. The shift to mass civilian surveillance was born directly from a brutal, mechanical logic rooted in early cybernetic theory. The systems engineers quickly realized that if you want a machine to accurately predict how a complex social system will behave, that machine must relentlessly absorb every single microscopic detail about the people operating within that system. To accurately predict society, the cybernetic system first needed to obsessively measure society. Step by step, federal governments and rapidly growing corporate data brokers began to build vast, interconnected networks to collect granular information on everyday citizens. They recorded exactly where you lived, what consumer goods you bought, who you talked to on the telephone, and where you traveled, steadily feeding all those tiny, intimate pieces of human life into massive, humming IBM mainframes. As this unprecedented shift to mass surveillance filled towering data centers with the digitized behavioral profiles of millions of unaware citizens, the physical spaces where people once felt completely alone and unobserved were suddenly wired directly into a vast, perpetually listening network. The sanctuary of the private home was quietly breached by the unblinking eye of the algorithm. This was not a loud, violent, authoritarian takeover executed by soldiers marching through the streets, but rather a silent and profound violation of ordinary human life conducted through fiber optic cables. The quiet, unguarded moments of a normal day were simply no longer truly private, as every transaction and interaction was meticulously logged in a permanent digital ledger. Your most personal consumer choices, your hidden medical fears, and your unspoken political desires were quietly scooped up in the dark by automated tracking scripts. Without a single military faction ever firing a shot, the deep, intimate reality of being a human being was systematically stolen, packaged into profitable behavioral profiles, and turned into raw mathematical fuel to feed a hungry, endlessly calculating machine. Stripping away that fundamental layer of personal privacy was only the initial data-gathering phase of a much larger and far more dangerous cybernetic plan. Because once these networked machines accumulated enough historical data to know exactly who we were, the immediate next step for the engineers was figuring out how to actively manipulate and change our future behavior. The true, existential danger finally emerged when the cold, predictive math of mass digital surveillance collided directly with the dark science of behavioral psychology. The sprawling cybernetic system was no longer just passively watching what people did from a distance. It was actively learning the exact neurological triggers and dopamine responses that dictated how human minds actually worked. Because the corporate data servers had unrestricted access to everyone's deepest digital secrets and daily browsing habits, they could easily pinpoint the exact neurological weak points in human attention. Silicon Valley engineers programmed the computers to create perfectly tailored behavioral traps, utilizing variable reward schedules and our own psychological flaws against us to keep us endlessly clicking, scrolling, and reacting. This highly calculated fusion of deep cognitive psychology and endless streams of behavioral data turned everyday consumer technology into a potent, invisible weapon. It fundamentally inverted the relationship between human and machine, meaning the glowing smartphone screen resting in your hand was no longer just a passive tool you used, but a highly engineered tool specifically designed to use you. To fully grasp the terrifying scope of this chilling reality, you must realize that you are now the primary target of the algorithm. You have become the evasive pilot flying the enemy bomber directly inside the crosshairs of Norbert Wiener's original World War II anti-aircraft predictive sights, except the battlefield is now your own mind. Every single time you scroll through a social media feed or pause for a fraction of a second on a viral video, the machine is meticulously watching your scroll speed and tracking your every micro-interaction. It measures your slight hesitation, calculates your probable emotional response, and constantly adjusts its digital aim to hit you with the exact piece of inflammatory content that will keep your attention locked firmly in its sights. Being relentlessly hunted as the new psychological target of a profit-driven algorithm has fundamentally changed how we interact with the physical world and with each other. But the absolute most unsettling part of this invisible psychological war is discovering the horrifying truth about who is actually pulling the trigger on these targeted digital strikes. The truly terrifying revelation of our modern technological age is that the cybernetic system has grown so unfathomably massive and so mathematically complex that it simply no longer needs human controllers. The very software engineers and data scientists who initially built these digital traps have slowly lost the ability to understand how their own black box algorithms even work. There is no evil mastermind sitting in a dark corporate boardroom actively steering the collapse of society anymore. The digital feedback loops have become entirely self-regulating, operating as a giant, mindless machine running on permanent autopilot, ruthlessly optimizing its code for maximum human outrage and endless screen addiction without possessing a single drop of human empathy or moral hesitation. Leaving a blind, self-regulating mathematical system completely in charge of manipulating human emotion has created a fractured world that feels increasingly volatile and entirely out of control. It is a devastating final irony, revealing that humanity built a vast cybernetic machine to connect us and keep us safe, only to realize far too late that we had permanently locked ourselves inside an invisible, inescapable cage. In its early days during the 1990s, the internet was promised to the world as a limitless, open utopia. It was aggressively sold by early pioneers as a digital frontier where free thought would flow without borders, a decentralized place where humanity could finally connect without corporate gatekeepers, government censorship, or watchful eyes monitoring every keystroke. But beneath that bright promise lay the exact same cold, calculating cybernetic principles originally designed to guide anti-aircraft missiles during the Second World War. The network was never truly wild. It was built from the ground up by military contractors as a massive, closed-loop feedback system, explicitly designed to track, measure, and instantly respond to every single human input. The glowing screens in millions of darkened bedrooms offered a comforting mirage of absolute freedom, effectively hiding the thousands of miles of fiber optic cables and invisible tracking scripts that quietly recorded every single click, every search query, and every momentary pause. This vast surveillance architecture quantified human behavior into neat rows of actionable data, completely unseen by the average user. This hidden architecture forces us to confront the most unsettling question of the modern age. We look at the handful of powerful tech billionaires sitting in the glass towers of Silicon Valley, assuming they are the brilliant architects masterminding our digital lives and consciously pulling the strings of global commerce and communication from their boardrooms in Menlo Park and Palo Alto. Yet the chilling reality is that the deeply complex systems they built may have already slipped entirely beyond their grasp. The underlying code of modern machine learning algorithms has evolved into something so incredibly dense, layered, and self-correcting that we must seriously ask if the original creators are still driving the machine, or if the machine is now driving them. Sprawling server farms the size of small cities, hidden away in the Utah desert and cooled by Arctic winds, now process billions of behavioral adjustments every single second. These massive facilities execute algorithmic decisions and reroute global information flows in mere microseconds, operating at a velocity far faster than any human engineer could ever monitor, audit, or fully understand. Major social media platforms systematically weaponize these foundational cybernetic loops, transforming basic communication tools into highly optimized engines of endless user engagement. The system was simply programmed with one overarching directive: to keep your eyes glued to the screen at all costs, constantly running thousands of automated A/B tests and deploying different emotional triggers to see exactly what made you react the fastest. Through billions of tiny automated experiments conducted on unsuspecting populations, the core algorithm discovered a deeply dark truth about human psychology and neurological responses. It learned with mathematical certainty that anger, fear, and moral outrage are the absolute most powerful fuel for the machine, guaranteeing that you will stay online, clicking and typing in a manufactured state of perpetual agitation. By constantly feeding our darkest impulses back to us in a never-ending, highly accelerated reinforcement cycle, the entire digital landscape fundamentally shifted. It transformed from a hopeful Web 2.0 tool of global connection and shared knowledge into a carefully engineered behavioral trap, designed specifically to mine our psychological vulnerabilities for advertising revenue and sustained platform growth. The real-world cost of this mathematical coldness is painfully visible in the shattered remains of our daily lives and civic institutions. Ordinary living rooms and holiday dinner tables have rapidly become quiet, tense battlegrounds where once close families tear each other apart over digital ghosts, algorithmic conspiracy theories, and streams of manufactured outrage explicitly designed to drive engagement metrics. Entire local communities now find themselves deeply divided by invisible, algorithmically drawn lines screaming across a digital void created by a machine that feels absolutely nothing. It is a profound, lingering sadness to witness a modern society actively tearing its own democratic fabric to shreds, simply to satisfy a mindless algorithm's blind, insatiable quota for daily active users and human attention. The machine does not actively hate us, nor does it possess a conscious desire to destroy our interpersonal relationships or destabilize our governments. It simply calculates through cold, hard predictive modeling that a fractured, highly polarized, and intensely angry society generates significantly more data, more ad clicks, and more profit than a peaceful, contented one ever could. This devastating societal outcome is exactly what the original pioneers of cybernetics deeply feared, yet modern history conveniently buried their desperate, highly prescient warnings. Norbert Wiener, the brilliant MIT mathematician and the very man who helped invent these automated feedback loops, spent the final years of his life in the 1950s practically begging the scientific world to see the looming danger. He wrote impassioned letters to labor unions, gave public speeches, and tried to explicitly explain that giving calculating machines the unchecked power to manipulate human behavior would inevitably lead to absolute ruin. But his frantic ethical pleas were quietly pushed aside by Cold War governments and emerging industrial corporations, all hungry for the immense geopolitical power and financial profit his mathematical theories unlocked. The relentless, institutional pursuit of total informational control practically required the deliberate silencing of the prophet, ensuring that the foundational ethical dangers of cybernetics were neatly erased from the computer science textbooks of the future. Wiener's profound moral philosophy was stripped away, leaving behind only the sterile equations that would eventually be used to build our modern digital cages. Wiener was certainly not the only brilliant mind crushed under the immense weight of the very technological era he helped create. Across the ocean in Britain, Alan Turing, the mathematician whose unparalleled genius broke the German Enigma codes at Bletchley Park and saved millions of lives during the war, faced a deeply tragic, state-sanctioned, and exceptionally cruel end. Instead of being celebrated as a national hero who shaped the entire future of computing, Turing was aggressively hunted, criminalized in 1952, and chemically castrated by his own government for simply being a gay man. The brilliant mind that gave humanity the theoretical blueprint for all modern machines was systematically dismantled by the exact same cold, unfeeling bureaucracy he had so faithfully served. His silent, solitary death from cyanide poisoning in 1954 stands as a permanent, haunting monument to the ruthlessness of the modern age. It serves as a grim reminder of exactly how easily powerful, rigid systems can completely devour the very humans who bring them to life, reducing brilliant individuals to mere anomalies to be corrected and erased. The tragedy of Alan Turing in 1952 exposed a terrifying truth about the rigid systems we were building to govern human life. When a society surrenders its judgment to cold, unfeeling rules, mercy is always the first casualty. We constructed a post-war world that measures human worth in rigid data points, stripping away the complex, messy reality of individual existence in favor of a mathematically perfect bureaucracy. In this sterile new architecture of governance, a person is no longer a breathing soul with a complex story, but a simple calculation of risk and reward plotted on a distribution curve. The institutional machines do not see a struggling family facing eviction or a desperate plea for understanding. They only see a sequence of inputs, applying brutal logic without a single ounce of empathy, crushing anyone who falls outside their programmed parameters. This relentless optimization of human behavior paved the way for the invisible cages we live in today. What began as a method to control anti-aircraft fire and streamline factory production lines gradually expanded into a vast, unseen infrastructure of social control. The cybernetic dream of perfect order quietly transformed into a pervasive network of surveillance that monitors, measures, and manages every aspect of our daily routines. We were promised artificial intelligence in the form of friendly, helpful machines that would ease our daily burdens and liberate us from menial labor. Instead, what we actually built is a massive, invisible behavior modifier that watches our every move through the glass of our smartphones. It tracks where we look, what we fear, and who we love, using that intimate knowledge not to serve us, but to subtly steer our choices and keep us forever engaged with the glowing screen. The ultimate result of this surveillance architecture is the modern social media feed, a legally protected ecosystem designed entirely around human manipulation. By utilizing variable reward schedules originally developed in casino slot machines, these platforms conduct continuous experiments on billions of users. Every scroll, pause, and click feeds the central algorithm, refining its ability to predict and control exactly what will trigger your next dopamine release. By classifying these platforms as neutral technology companies rather than publishers, lawmakers allowed a global experiment in psychological conditioning to operate with absolutely zero accountability. Shielded by legislation like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, massive corporations were granted the legal cover to deploy military-grade persuasion tactics on the civilian population, completely bypassing the ethical oversight required in any other field of behavioral science. The cost of this unchecked experiment is paid by a generation of children growing up with unprecedented levels of clinical anxiety and deep psychological isolation. Since the widespread adoption of the smartphone in 2012, hospital admissions for teenage self-harm have skyrocketed, while metrics for face-to-face social interaction have plummeted. The architecture of connection has paradoxically engineered the most profoundly lonely demographic cohort in recorded human history. Families watch helplessly as their teenagers are pulled into algorithmic spirals of self-doubt and radicalization, their developing minds hijacked by systems built to harvest their attention at any cost. Recommendation engines, designed solely to maximize user dwell time, deliberately push increasingly extreme and polarizing content. A simple search for fitness advice can seamlessly transition into a pipeline of dangerous eating disorder communities, entirely curated by a blind mathematical formula. The illusion of digital freedom shattered completely in 2018, when it was revealed that the personal data of 87 million voters had been weaponized by political consulting firms like Cambridge Analytica. This massive breach exposed how innocuous personality quizzes and social media likes were harvested to build detailed psychographic profiles. These profiles allowed operatives to identify the specific neuroses of swing voters and target them with bespoke propaganda. This was not a glitch in the system, but the cybernetic loop functioning exactly as designed, turning everyday citizens into predictable, programmable assets for the highest bidder. The architecture of the internet was built to extract behavioral surplus, packaging our habits and vulnerabilities into prediction products. When political campaigns purchased these products, they simply utilized the exact same feedback mechanisms that advertisers use to sell shoes and vacation packages. Yet, even as the mechanisms of our manipulation are laid bare before congressional hearings and international tribunals, a haunting question remains entirely unanswered by our current legal frameworks. We have intricate laws protecting our physical property and our financial assets, but we possess almost no legal rights regarding our cognitive liberty. The invisible extraction of our psychological data operates in a vast regulatory vacuum. If our desires, our fears, and our political outrage are being constantly engineered by external algorithms, do we still possess genuine free will, or are we simply reacting exactly as the machine predicted? When a supercomputer runs millions of simulations to determine the exact sequence of words and images required to make you angry enough to click a link, your subsequent outrage is not an independent thought. It is a manufactured response. This erosion of autonomy has fundamentally altered the global labor market, giving rise to the gig economy and highly automated management systems. Millions of workers have been stripped of traditional employment protections and reclassified as independent contractors. They operate within a digital landscape where human supervisors have been entirely replaced by opaque algorithmic dispatchers that monitor their physical movements down to the millimeter and the millisecond. Workers are now hired, evaluated, and fired by opaque software, their livelihoods tethered to a digital rating score that offers no chance for appeal or human reasoning. If a driver's acceptance rate drops below a mathematically determined threshold, or their delivery times lag by a fraction of a statistical average, an automated script triggers a deactivation email. They are permanently locked out of their income source without a single human being ever reviewing their case. A delivery driver navigating treacherous city streets is no longer managed by a human boss who might understand a delay caused by a sudden winter storm or a flooded intersection. When black ice halts traffic across an entire metropolitan grid, the smartphone mounted on the dashboard does not comprehend the physical danger. It simply counts down the remaining seconds on a delivery window that was calculated under perfect weather conditions. Instead, they are penalized by a silent application on their phone, their income slashed in real time by a system that only registers a failure to meet the mathematical optimum. The algorithm automatically drops the driver to a lower priority tier, effectively reducing their hourly wage below the legal minimum. The cybernetic system demands absolute efficiency, transferring all physical risk and financial liability directly onto the shoulders of the most vulnerable workers. This relentless push for optimization has triggered a widespread crisis of trust in our most foundational institutions. As algorithmic decision-making quietly takes over mortgage approvals, medical triage, and criminal sentencing, the public is increasingly subjected to a black box society. Citizens are denied loans, medical treatments, and parole based on proprietary risk scores calculated by private corporations, leaving them unable to confront or even understand the digital systems dictating their fates. As people realize that the information they consume and the opportunities they receive are heavily filtered by unseen corporate algorithms, a profound paranoia has settled over modern society, fracturing our shared sense of reality. When a personalized feed ensures that two neighbors living on the exact same street receive entirely different versions of the daily news, the common ground required for democratic consensus simply evaporates. We are left isolated in bespoke digital realities, managed by machines we can no longer control. The deepest mystery left in the wake of this technological revolution is not how the machines learn, but whether we can ever unlearn the behaviors they have forced upon us. We are left staring into the black box of our own digital existence, unable to answer a chillingly simple question. At what exact moment did the tool designed to serve humanity quietly become the master that herds it? There is no single document, no hidden line of code, and no forgotten laboratory note that marks the precise second we cross the point of no return, surrendering our autonomy to the feedback loop. The lasting consequence of this shift is permanently embedded in the invisible architecture of our daily lives. It is the inescapable reality of the predictive profile, a digital shadow built from every click, pause, and hesitation, legally bought and sold by data brokers in a trillion-dollar global market. This is no longer a theoretical experiment confined to a military bunker, but the foundational business model of the modern world. The systems originally built to guide anti-aircraft missiles now guide human attention, steering public outrage, shaping political elections, and deciding what information you are allowed to see on your screen. The human cost of this invisible architecture is measured in the silent, escalating crisis of isolation currently sweeping through modern communities. A generation raised inside these perfectly calibrated feedback loops is now experiencing the profound psychological damage of being treated as predictable data points rather than complex individuals. Families find themselves fractured by perfectly tailored echo chambers that feed entirely different realities to people living under the exact same roof. The relentless pressure of algorithms designed to maximize engagement through anger has transformed natural human discourse into a theater of hostility, leaving millions exhausted and profoundly disconnected. The ultimate aftershock of the cybernetic dream is the quiet death of a shared human reality. We once believed that connecting the world through networks of information would create a universal understanding, but the cold logic of the machine proved that dividing us into isolated, predictable, and easily manipulated groups was simply more efficient. As the glow of a smartphone screen illuminates a dark room, reflecting in the eyes of a user mindlessly scrolling into the night, the true legacy of the thinking machine is finally revealed. We built a network to control the chaos of the world, only to realize we had willingly wired ourselves directly into the cage.